So we're going to be talking about the next chunk of our demographic series, specifically talking about the Orthodox Christian world, which is a huge swath of territory stretching from Russia to Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova, Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia. Now, these countries have three characteristics in common that have really shaped their demographic destinies, and none of them have been great. The first is broad-scale economic dislocation. These were the parts of the former communist world that didn't do well even at the height of communism. They weren't very advanced, and especially when the post-Cold War system erupted, they didn't have anything really to contribute aside from raw commodities. Their industry was outdated. They weren't producing steel like the Czech Republic or IT stuff like the Latvians. They were only doing grains and raw materials and energy. And you can get growth from that. You can get wealth from that. You can get infrastructure and development from that. But unless it is really, really well managed, the population just doesn't see a whole lot of it. So these countries were in and out of horrible recessions for really 30 years. It's a less bad in places like Romania and Bulgaria because they did ultimately get into the EU in the late 2000s, but they were the last ones in line. Serbia took kind of a double hit because they don't have a lot of raw materials that they can export to the world. And in the aftermath of the NATO bombings in the Yugoslav wars in the early 1990s, Serbia never moved on. So even with the Russians under Putin going from win to win in terms of global policy and generating a lot of income from oil, in Serbia there was a whole lot of nothing. And politics basically became locked down in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. And the country really was never able to advance whatever is next. And that holds true even today. Okay, what's second? Because of the economic dislocation, because so many people didn't see a lot of opportunity, you had huge immigration from all of these states, mostly to Western Europe, some to the United States and Canada. In the cases of Romania and Bulgaria, once they got into the EU, if anything, the outmigration accelerated because there were then fewer restrictions. The Russians easily lost 10 million people in the 1990s and early 2000s to the wider world. And in the case of Moldova, perhaps as much as 1/4 of the female population under age 50 left, never to return. A lot of them going into the sex trade because there really wasn't a lot of an option because education in Moldova during the Soviet periods was even very low. Serbia is probably the country that has suffered the most from this outmigration because, again, the government just has never moved on and there's never been a plan economically for what's next. The third one kind of flies under the radar and is probably going to piss a few people off, but here we are. Birth control in this region, the primary method is abortion. So on average, more than 7 out of 10 pregnancies across this space are terminated. And if you have one abortion, I know, I'm a dude, I really have no right to say this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that it's not critical to your health. But if you have 10, you're probably endangering your future fertility. So between a very low death rate, a very high abortion rate, and very high infertility rates because of the weird intersection of healthcare and birth control and economic collapse, it's arguable that a lot of these countries, probably Russia right at the very top of that list, simply could not repopulate even if the economic conditions were to turn around. So this is the part of the world that is duking it out with Northeast Asia for the lowest birth rates and the fastest national mortality, if that's the right term, in the world. So that's kind of the overview. Those are the three big issues that shape the region as a whole. But we do need to give additional attention to the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians have had a series of stacked geopolitical disasters. World War I, World war II, Stalin's famines, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, and then the post-Cold War collapse. All these kind of stacked on each other, and so that the current generation that is now in their 20s is the smallest one they've ever had. The Russians say they've got a metric butt ton of teenagers and that the demographic turn has been made and they're going to be fine. If they are telling the truth about that, that would be the only of their data that they're telling the truth off. More likely that we actually have fewer teenagers than 20-somethings, and you'll see that in the demographic graphic that we've patched into the show. More likely, their data is more similar to the situation in Ukraine. One more thing about the Russian demographics, they're not equal. Just as in the United States, where places like Utah or Texas have higher birth rates than places like New York or Connecticut because they're less urbanized or have different cultural norms. The same is true in Russia. Russia is not just Russian. The Russian state was originally founded in the area around Moscow, and they discovered that they really had no borders that were secure. So the way they decided to deal with that was to expand, conquer all their neighbors, consolidate, and then expand again, conquer all of those neighbors, and so on and so on and so on until they get to the Russia that we more or less know today and during the Soviet period. That means that there are dozens of conquered peoples living within the Russian system. Some of them have demographic stats that are just as bad as the Russians, but not all of them. A lot of the Turkic minorities, most notably the Chechens, the Dagestanis, the Bashkirs, and the Tatars, actually have very robust demographic structures and are doing very well from a health and a growth point of view. Well, the last decent number that we've got from the Russians was done by the 1989 Soviet census. And at that point, the best guess, Soviet numbers after all, was that 20% of the Russian population within the Russian Federation was non-Russian. So 80% Russian, 20% non-Russian. Well, folks, that was over 30 years ago. It's probably closer to 25 to 30% today that's non-Russian. And if you fast forward another 20 years, you're talking about probably 30 to 35%. Now, these are all guesstimates upon guesstimates because this is Russia and getting good data is next to impossible even before there was a war. But we do know for sure that even if you include all of the minorities, the Russians only have 8 million men aged 20 to 30. 6 months from now, at least 1 million of those are going to be committed to the war in Ukraine. We already have over 100,000 dead. We already have about 1 million who have fled the country. So one way or another, the Ukraine war is the last conventional war that the Russians are ever going to be able to fight because they simply won't have enough people. Now, the Ukrainians have no reason to lie about their demographic data aside from the fact that it's absolutely atrocious. And if you look at it, you look just the collapse from the 50s to the 40s to the 30s to the 20s to the teens to kids, you'll notice that this isn't just a demographically spent country. This is a demographically dissolving country. So unfortunately, even if the Ukrainians achieve runaway success in this war this year, it's already too late. Even before the Russians started kidnapping children in 1,000, perhaps hundreds of thousands from Ukraine, this was a country that simply didn't have enough people under age 40 to even theoretically repopulate themselves. So within 20 or 30 years, we are looking at the Ukrainian ethnicity vanishing from this world, and probably the Russian ethnicity no more than 20 or 30 years behind. Like I said, they are duking it out with Northeast Asia to see who vanishes faster, which means we have to turn to Northeast Asia next because that is going to be the part of the world where, from an economic point of view, these demographic turnings have the greatest impact.
Russia is not just the world's largest exporter of weed. Russia is not just deliberately destroying the physical agricultural infrastructure of the world's 5th largest exporter. This space is the single largest supplier of fertilizer as a category, as well as the world's single largest supplier of potash to the world. Already, those exports are down by about 1/3. And one of the fun things to keep in mind about Russian infrastructure is it is old. Most of the Russian industrial capacity for agriculture was built in the 60s under Khrushchev. And the only reason it still operates today is with a lot of Western tech, duct tape, and help. And that's all stopped. We are already seeing industrial accidents in the Russian energy and agricultural space that are so big in exploding capacity that we can see them from orbit. We should count on all of this going away. All right, let's talk energy. This is a pipeline map. The green are oil, the red are natural gas, and the places that matter are these 2 ports, Primorsk on the Baltic Sea in the north and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea in the south. And it's really all about insurance. This gets really sexy really fast. So you cannot have your vessel enter a port or exit a port or go into a constrained waterway like, say, the Turkish Straits without an insurance policy. You have to have indemnification coverage. Well, one of the many aspects of the sanctions is that the Europeans, Japanese, and Americans, and that's over 95% of all policies, have said, no, we're not going to insure any Russian-flagged, chartered, or owned vessel. The way the Russians are getting around this, 2-step process. Number 1, they formed their own insurance. It's kind of sloppy, but it's there. And they're covering ships, shuttle ships, because you can't get a super tanker into these ports. They're too shallow, to run cargo from these ports around Europe to off the coast of Portugal, where step 2, The Chinese have rented a half a dozen supertankers, lashed them together into a super raft, and they're doing sea-to-sea transfers from the shuttle tankers to the raft to additional supertankers who will then do the long circumcontinental trip to the East Asian coast. And in addition, you'll notice that the routes out of these places go by a lot of countries that really don't think very highly of the Russians right now. And since the Russians are the ones doing the insuring, and there's a sanctions regime in place, if you're like, say, Lithuania, and you just wake up and go, you know what, I'm going to fuck with the Russians today. And they just go and they grab a ship, that's a $500 million to $1 billion payout. And at that point, no one else is going to want to run the route. So not only can you bankrupt the Kremlin, you can wreck their export route all at once. That does a lot more than it sounds like, because these ports don't have storage capacity, very little. And so if ships stop taking crude away, pressure builds up in the pipes all the way back to the wellhead. And this isn't North Dakota. This is a place that's actually cold. It's permafrost. You guys are all Iowans, you get it. In the winter, as long as you're moving, you're fine. It's when you stop that you die. Same with crude. As it's flowing through that subsurface frozen layer, as long as it's moving, it's liquid. But if it stops moving for any reason, it consolidates into a gel plug, and the water that comes up as a byproduct of all oil production freezes into ice. And when water freezes, it expands, and it pops the pipe from the inside. Now, the last time this happened at scale, it was 1992. The damage was so horrific, it took the Russians 30 years to repair it. And it wasn't the Russians who did the repairs. It was the Western oil firms who are no longer there. We're looking at 4 million barrels per day of Siberian production, Western Siberian production, that is in some degree of danger. If that all goes offline, oil is not like soy. If you don't get soy, you have wheat or pork or whatever. There are substitutes. If you don't have oil, things stop. The price reflects that. If you need a gallon of gas to get to work and you can only get 9/10 of a gallon, not only will you pay whatever you have to get that last tenth, the price you pay for that last tenth applies to the entire market. Inelastic demand, marginal supplier, marginal demand sets the price. 4 million barrels a day goes offline. You're talking $150 to $180 a barrel, easy, in a very short period of time. Now, that's all else being equal, and the first law of economics is all else is never equal. But that's the scale of what we're looking at here. I can even give you a time when we should look at this very seriously, and that's January 1, because that's when the sanctions expand from all Russian vessels to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. Next year is going to be really interesting in many, many, many ways. All right, same map. We're going to look at natural gas now. These are the red lines. This is the one that matters. This is Nord Stream. This isn't a marginal supplier to Germany. It's their primary supply. It's 40% of their total demand. And somebody blew it up a few months ago. Germans are not like Americans. I mean, we talk a good paranoid game when it comes to energy security, but we really don't care. We don't care where we get our energy. We could get some from Canada, some from Mexico. We make a bunch ourselves. We take some from Saudi Arabia. If we don't think anyone is watching all that closely, we'll take some from Venezuela, whatever. We don't care. Germans don't have that option. They've got precision manufacturing. They're in a tough neighborhood with no energy. They prefer large, long-term contracts at fixed prices and fixed volumes with state-owned players that they find more reliable. And then the stuff has to be shipped on fixed infrastructure, so there's no variability. So they work with Russia's Gazprom. They bring it in from Nord Stream, 40% of the total. It's gone. Now they have replaced the volumes with 7 different marginal suppliers. We're now in an environment where the Germans are having a very mild winter. Their reserves are completely full. They've already lined up replacements, but because they're all marginal, prices in Germany are now 6 times what they were the day the war started. They're not going down until they get a new mainline supplier, and the nearest non-Russian one is Nigeria. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to think about German manufacturing a lot differently because they do. We're also not very agnostic or not very interested as to where we get all of our parts. Some from Texas, some from Korea, some from Mexico, whatever. Germans can't function that way. So they use the natural gas that they bring in from the Russians. They use it to power their electricity system, and it's the feedstock for their petrochemical system. And those petrochemicals are not exported. They then feed in to support the entirety of the German manufacturing sector. That first step is broken, so the rest of it is breaking. The Germans have already stopped all industrial processing of natural gas. They're no longer making fertilizer. They're no longer smelting aluminum. They're no longer forging steel. They had already cut their automotive sector by over a third before we had hiccups with demand about a month ago. The whole thing is shutting down because the base thing that it's built on is gone and is not coming back. We have, at most, 24 months before the German industrial model collapses. BASF, their largest chemical concern, is in the process of physically dismantling all of their industrial plant in Germany and shipping it to Louisiana in the hope that they can build enough petrochemical capacity here and ship the product back to Germany to save their country in less than 2 years. But that would require a build-out in Louisiana that is faster than what the Germans did during World War II. That's not going to happen. If you want a Beamer, buy it now. This is the last model. Be sure to get 10 years of parts too. Oh, and it's going to get so much worse because this is the backup plan. Pipes that go through the conflict zone in a war that is defined by artillery exchanges. Never forget that on the third day of the war, the Russians accidentally blew up Chernobyl. Yeah, this is going to get so much worse before it gets better.